Hi everybody, this here's Night Breeze, and I'm here with part two of my y- I guess lessons on old Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Um, my first video really had a pretty decent response for my videos, and so I thought, yeah, I think I will continue this. So today I'm going to start off talking about some of the stats. Um, the main ones. Dungeons and Dragons uses a pretty standard setup with strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma. And then there is an optional one that was brought in through the Unearthed Arcana for comeliness. I I might touch on that a little bit, but for the most part, I'm going to focus on the main six. So each class in Dungeons and Dragons has ruling stats. When I say ruling stats, for instance, a fighter. You want your fighter strong. You know, um, you want your clerics wise. You want your thieves dexterous. Dexterous. You want intelligent wizards. you know. So, and most classes, if their prime stat is a certain level, they get a bonus to their experience points. But so with strength, that is your muscle. That's gonna be your strength. It's pretty obvious. It ranges from 3. For normal characters, it ranges from a 3 to 18. If you're a warrior class, your fighter, your paladins, rangers, barbarians, then if you have an 18 strength, you got to roll a percentile dice, and then you had from 1 to 100. So, just touching on a few things here. Low strength gave you penalties to your hitting with a sword, or a melee weapon. The damage you could do, how much weight you could carry, your chance. You come up to a locked door, you want to try to knock it down. Well, if you're weak, you got a penalty to that. If you're stronger, you have a better chance. And again, if you were a higher level of strength, you got bonuses to your hit probability, your damage, how much weight you could carry. You'd even have a chance to bend bars and lift gates, which you classic portcullis that drops down. The hero grabs a hold of it and lifts it up and lets the party in. A low strength character has no chance of doing that. Now, the average range for an average human would be an 8 to about 11. That would usually what's considered your average. So beyond lower than an 8, you got your lower strengths. Above an 11, you start getting into your what's considered higher strengths. But at 16 is where you start really seeing the major bonuses. At 16, you got a +1 to your damage. 17, you got a +1 to hit and a +1 to damage. All the way up with an 18-100, you had +3 to hit, which, especially at low levels, is a big thing. And then you get a +6 to damage. So with the right weapon, you could be doing, You could be killing monsters in one hit, for low level. The average kobold had 1 to 4 hit points. So you take a character with an 18-100 strength, all he has to do is hit. The critter's dead. Weight allowances go up tremendously at these higher strengths. And I kind of touched on it last time. They have a chart, and it tells you what levels certain things are. On the strength table, at a 5. So a character that has a 5 or lower strength in first edition could only be a magic user by the strict rules. At level 6, that was the minimum to be a gnome, half-orc, or halfling. An 8 was minimum for a dwarf. You had to have a 9 to be able to qualify as a fighter. A 12 allowed you to qualify for either the assassin class or a paladin. Paladins had a lot of stat requirements. They were one of the rarest classes because of it. Rangers needed a 13. At 14, that's the maximum strength a female halfling character could achieve without magic assistance. I'm going to qualify that. There's ways of increasing your stats beyond these limits with magic. And yes, in first edition, second edition, and actually I think even third edition, but I'm not sure. I never really played third. Females had a lower strength maximum than males. Not politically correct, and I know people get angry when you even talk about that, but it's that was just the way it was. A 15 was the maximum strength for a female gnome. It was also the minimum needed for a monk. 16 was the max for a female elf. 17 was the max for a female dwarf or female half-elf or male halfling. Then you got your 18. That's the maximum strength for non-fighter or non-warrior characters. Then you get going 18-1 to 1850 range. That was grouped together. That was the maximum for a female human or a male gnome. 51 to 75 percentage was maximum for a male elf or a female half-orc. 76 to 90 is maximum for a male half-elf. 91 to 99, maximum strength for a male dwarf or a male half-orc. Now, a lot of DMs, well, it depends. If one that played a little looser with the rules, a half-orc could have a lot higher, or could have a higher strength than that. And then 18-100 was the maximum that a human could achieve. Naturally. Now, I'm going to take this in the order it is in the book. It is not in the normal order. But they have intelligence being next. And there's your book learning, memorization, your IQ, and it influenced every character in the number of languages they could learn for bonuses. It was also, if you played with the optional proficiency rules, intelligence could affect how many proficiencies you had. Now that obviously is the prime stat for wizards. But and with a wizard, I mean, it even had it where beyond or below, at certain intelligences, wizards were capped on the level of spells they could achieve. So, at a 4 intelligence, that's the minimum for a half elf. At a 5, anything 5 or lower, you can only be a fighter. And that's where it starts in with Scar with his stats not being, my favorite character I mentioned before, where he starts getting into where he couldn't exist by the strict reading of the rules. Yes, he was a fighter. He qualified there. However, because of his wisdom and his charisma, he couldn't exist. Because there were 2 other classes that can only were limited. So, but I digress. A level 6 was the minimum for a halfling. 7 is the minimum for a gnome. An 8 is minimum for an elf. A 9 is the minimum for a paladin or magic user. Okay. At level 10, that was the minimum intelligence for a magic user to use a 5th level spell. An 11 is the minimum intelligence for an assassin. A 12 is the minimum to use 6th level spells. 13 is a minimum for a ranger character. And there's actually a reason for that somewhat when we discuss rangers, I'll point it out. A 14 is the minimum intelligence to use 7th level magic user spells. A 15 is the minimum for an illusionist character. Now in first edition, and this was changed in second, but in first edition, illusionists and magic users were separate classes. The illusionists had their own spell lists. There was, So they're just told they were separate. A 16 is the minimum to use 8th level magic spells. A 17 is the max for a half-orc character. And then an 18 is the minimum to cast 9th level spells. That was pretty much the highest level of magic achievable without using optional rules. There was rules in second edition I know for sure. I'm not sure about first for 10th level magic spells. But again, they were optional and they were pardon me. There were a lot of extra stuff went into that. Also, intelligence helped determine how many spells a magic user could have in their spellbook, as well as their chance to learn the spell. At a minimum ability score of 9, bare minimum, he'd have a 35% chance to learn a spell. So he's adventuring along, he finds a scroll of Fireball. He's high enough level to cast it, and so he tries to learn it. He has a 35% chance. And, he could only have, he had a minimum in his spell book of 4 spells per level that he could cast, and a maximum of 6. That's a pretty lean spell book. And that went up, they actually, for an 18, again, that's where, for the most part, without assistance, a normal character would reach. It was an 85% chance to learn. They could have 9 spells minimum and 18 per level maximum. That doesn't mean they could cast all 18 at once, or that, but they could memorize it. But in their spell book, they could have 18 spells per level. Again, that's if you use that rule. I know DMs that don't never really paid attention to that rule. And if they achieve a 19 somehow, then they can. It didn't matter how many or spells they found; they can add them all to their spell books with a 95% chance to learn it. And now, if say the character tried to, in the example, tried to learn the fireball, and he failed, he couldn't do it. I believe. I believe if his intelligence changed somehow, he could try to learn it again. I also know some DMs that would allow you to check, say, every level. So you go along, you increase your level. So you're a more powerful wizard. They would give you the opportunity to recheck. Let's see if you can learn the spell. Okay. So your wisdom. That's kind of your judgment, the willpower, intuitiveness, enlightenment is one of the terms they use in the description. It can affect some of the saving throws, and it is the prime stat for a cleric. So, because you want your clerics to be wise, It would also, with clerics, give them bonus spells per level. If they had certain, high enough stat. So with those, at a 5 or lower, you can only be a thief. Well, that's where Scar could not do it. Because his intelligence was a 3, his wisdom was a 3. So, because of his intelligence, he can only be a fighter. Because of his wisdom, he can only be a thief. And I believe with his charisma, he can only be an assassin. So, it was impossible to exist. At a 9, that's the minimum for a cleric. You couldn't be a cleric if you didn't have a 9 or higher. A 12 is the minimum for a druid. Again, clerics and druids were completely separate. I'll get more into that with the classes when I do classes. A 13 is the minimum for a paladin or a multi-classed half-elven cleric. Half-elves were one of only 2, if I remember right. No. There's one, I think dwarves could be multi-class cleric. But, again, we'll get into that more with the classes. 14 is the maximum wisdom for a half-orc. They are not very wise. Half-orcs, basically, are going to be your brutish, strong, while the orcs themselves are a, very warlike race of monsters. Half-orcs kind of have the same general bend. But it's also the minimum for a ranger character. A 15 is the minimum for a monk. A 17 is the maximum for a halfling. Think of the hobbits. They could be intelligent. But they weren't the wise race overall. There were exceptions, but It's also the minimum for a cleric to use a 6th level clerical spell. And then you needed an 18 to use the 7th level clerical spells, which is the highest level. That also applied to druids with their 6th and 7th level spells. For a cleric with high wisdom, at a 13, they got an extra 1st level spell they could memorize. Again, they got another one at 14. They got at 15 a 2nd level, and at 16 a 2nd level spell. And then at 17 they got a 3rd level extra, and at 18 they could memorize a 4th level extra. So, that was kind of a, and the reason why I'm going through these charts like this is help you kind of keep in mind when if you create a character, keep in mind what you're looking for in your character, and then you can apply it in how you distribute your stats, depending on what which style of stat creation is used. Now for dexterity, that's going to be your hand-eye coordination, your agility, reflexes, balance. A high dexterity would be a tightrope walker. Olympic acrobat. Where a low dexterity would be probably somebody tripping over their own feet. But at a 5 dexterity, you can only be a cleric. At 6, it was the minimum for a half-elf or a magic user. The magic user needs to be a little bit dexterous in the fingers. You're manipulating spell components, doing semantic gestures for your spells. You need that little bit of manual dexterity. A 7 is the minimum for an elf. An 8 is the minimum for a halfling. A 9 is the minimum for a thief. That's the prime stat for a thief. This prime requisite is the term that 2nd edition used for it. Now, I was trying to remember. Again, your thieves, you want them to be dexterous. A 12 is the minimum for an assassin. 14 is the maximum dexterity of a half-orc. Again, big brutes. 15 is the minimum for a monk. Now, monk was an optional class, and when you think of a monk, picture a kung fu monk. That's what they're talking about. A 16 is the minimum for an illusionist. Their gestures are going to be a little bit more difficult, and you're trying to hide the gestures so people don't notice it. A 17 is the maximum for a dwarf. Again, dwarves are not really thought of as dexterous. Now, the dexterity also improves your saving throws, or penalized them if you were low enough. At a 6 or lower, you start having penalties to your AC. At 15 and higher, you start getting bonuses. Also at 16, you start getting bonus to your missile attacks. Using a bow, throwing a knife. That you could get bonuses to hit that way. And there was also, you know, at thieves could get penalties or bonuses depending on their dexterity. For the most part, to have no penalties, you had to have a 13 dexterity. And at 16, you started getting bonuses. Your dexterity helped you out. Okay, your constitution. This is going to be how fit you are, how healthy, resistant to disease. I don't remember which book it was in, but the description for an 18 constitution is Rasputin. The legend of Rasputin. Poison, stab, shot, and then thrown into a lake. His cause of death was drowning. That's your high constitution. So, constitution affected your hit points. It could actually affect it quite a bit at higher levels. It also, your system shock. You got, your body just took massive damage. You had your arm cut off. Well, higher constitution meant you're more likely to not just die, your heart just quits. It also resurrection. Say you're dead. Your party took you to a priest. They cast a raise dead spell on you. You have the possibility of coming to and just dying right back. That was one of the weird, kind of strange things to me. But the higher your constitution, the better chance you had of surviving. Of actually being raised from the dead. So, at a 5 constitution, you can only be an illusionist. At a 6, that was your minimum to be an elf or a half-elf. A 7's the minimum for a fighter. Again, it's not required. It's not a prime requisite like strength is. But, your fighters are going to be your tanks. You want them up on the front line soaking up damage. So your squishy wizards aren't getting killed. An 8 is the minimum for a gnome. A 9 is the minimum for a paladin. A 10 is the minimum for a halfling. 11 is the minimum for a monk. 12 is the minimum for a dwarf. Dwarves are real healthy, sturdy. The 13 is the minimum for a half-orc. And 14 is the minimum for a ranger. At 15, you start getting your bonuses to hit points. Any character at 15 would have a +1 per level of to their hit points. At 16, they'd have a +2. At 17 and 18, everybody but a warrior class still had just a +2. At 17, a warrior class, your paladins, rangers, barbarians, whatever. Actually, I think barbarians, I'd have to look at the optional rules, but I think barbarians actually had a wholly different way of figuring out their bonus. But they get your fighters get a +3. At 18, they get a +4. So, they're going to get those extra hit points per level. And that brings us to charisma. Depending on your play style and your character and all this. No, there is no class that has charisma as a true prerequisite, as far as I can remember. But it is it can be beneficial to anybody, and in a couple cases, there's some pretty high requirement for charisma in certain classes. But that's going to be your well, in the original rules, they state physical attractiveness, but that's where comeliness came in, and that was not so much. But your persuasiveness and personal magnetism. When you think of high charisma, think of someone who can say the most evil, foulest things and bring the crowd to their side. Now, obviously, I don't want to get this video taken down, but think leader of Germany, World War II. His charisma, would be like an 18. Trying to think of some of the others. Well, Alexander the Great was another one, who was very charismatic. JFK somewhat. I don't think he's quite that high, but that's going to be your, like I said, you could convince anybody to do anything almost. At the other end, for charisma, somebody who can't link two words to get, who can offend, the sweetest, nicest person just by opening their mouth. So, it affected how many henchmen you could have, how loyal your henchmen would be, and kind of the reaction people have to you. It was kind of like I was describing. Now, the reaction was rolled on a percentile dice. A 3 charisma gave you a negative 25% penalty to that roll. An 18 gave you a plus 35%. So, that gives you the idea of how charisma, or, why I say you could almost convince anybody to do anything. But at a 5, you can only be an assassin. At an 8 was the minimum for an elf. A 12 was the maximum for a half-orc. Again, half-orcs, just big, brute, A 15 is the minimum for a druid. A 16 is the maximum charisma for a dwarf, but that's qualified. That's for if a dwarf is, interacting with people that aren't dwarfs. If a dwarf is interacting with other dwarves, their charisma is considered to be 2 points higher. But dwarves come across kind of blunt. Is one way to look at it. A 17 is the minimum for a paladin character. It's where, like I said, some of the stat requirements for a paladin are very hard to achieve. But so that's the stats. Comeliness, like I said, I'll get into some optional rules later, but comeliness is strictly how good looking you are. It is influenced a little bit by charisma. Um, and it can help you with people's immediate reaction. I mean, people are more likely to listen to somebody who is beautiful than somebody that looks hideous. That's just human nature. First impressions. Now, I hope you enjoy this. I know I'm not making this super exciting and that, but yeah, this is kind of into the dry stuff, the mechanics, starting off a basis. I think I'm going to end this video. In the next video, I'm going to get into the races. Again, actually, part of the reason I'm doing this is because there's a whole big thing about, D&D, new D&D, being, the different races and stuff, and you gotta think about it. There is trends, certain mental, what's the word I'm looking for? Patterns, so it all works out in the end. But yeah, I'll do races next time. So thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this, leave a like, sub. Tell your friends. Who knows? Maybe one of them will enjoy it. And as always, leave me a comment. I do look forward to reading your comments. I enjoy it. So hopefully I'll see you all soon, and have a great time, everybody.